first of all, it gives me great pleasure to be here and to provide some opening statements. This is looks to be quite a challenging and quite an interesting session, and it is still greater a pleasure for me to see that the participants, especially the panelists, represent diverse backgrounds. And I think in times of today, especially the water related challenges, whether you want to study or you want to manage or you want to govern, whatever is it, I think we need a holistic perspective and trying to and actually we try to and we need to look at all the aspects from different angles, and that's why we really need to, as very rightly stated by the title, breaking silos. So I think this really these two words actually contain a lot of material in them, and that is the spirit of this panel discussion. And we hope that the discussions, the ideas, the by the proponents who are the panelists in this session, as well as the discussions which will be ensuing after their talks and after their ideas inputs, will really throw a good light and will allow us to really look at the water challenge from a multidimensional, in a holistic manner, so that it will be better for all of us. So with this, I now move over and give this control to, I think it's Dr. Divya.
Thank you, Professor Joshi. A warm welcome to everyone. This is the closing day of our symposium, and I hope everyone has learned something new in the past 3 days. Our endeavor at the symposium was to touch on multiple aspects of natural hazard in the Himalayan region. And this panel also, we are trying to touch upon multiple viewpoints to understand about the issues in a much richer way. So the panel is diverse from diverse backgrounds, but I think one thing which connects all of us here at the panel also, and maybe in the audience, is the pain of seeking truth. So either whether we are a researcher or an activist or a journalist or anybody who's in this area is trying to search for truth and try to understand it in their own ways. So, in the panel discussion, I would want to draw the attention of especially the early career researchers and students so that they can learn from all the domains across and create synergy to create better knowledge which is usable. Because I think in the previous sessions also, we have understood that we have to understand who's taking this knowledge. So we have to have that perspective that the knowledge or the research which we create is usable. Like the saying goes, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, you have to come together. So that's the main aim, that we have to come together. And the focus of the symposium was natural hazard, but I would like the panelists to give their deeper point of views, because that's where we'll all benefit. So I think every panelist will be can take like 5 to 6 minutes to present their perspective, and then we'll go ahead with a moderated discussion, and then we'll open the floor to the audience also to take questions. So let us begin. So first of all, I will like to invite Neha and congratulate her on starting IYWN. Again, the theme is breaking silos there, and I think she also truly believes in it. So Neha, I would like to introduce her briefly. Neha is a researcher motivated to enhance engagement in social hydrology space across various disciplines to be able to advance the science and practice of water in India. So I'll be putting the brief bio in the chat box where the audience can read about it. So over to you, Neha.
Yeah, thank you, Divya. I'll just share my screen. So, thank you very much, Divya, for extending this invitation to me, and also giving me this opportunity to come and talk about an initiative which is so close to my heart, which is the Indian Youth Water Network. So, I resonate with the vision of breaking silos, of learning and listening from each other, while having respect for each other's point of views. I suppose beyond our own dualities, to seek knowledge in the spirit of learning from each other, of adequate problematization. And this is where I suppose engagement with different disciplines become very important. IYWN was founded on the principles of interdisciplinarity, inclusivity, compassion, along with the spirit of promoting team science, collaboration, and demystifying science communication for each other and for the masses of the society, for whom we often engage with whom we often engage with for problem solving. Now, sharing my personal journey with the Himalayan region a bit and reflecting on it, I studied masters in water management, which was heavy on the engineering hydrology. And initially, I was for the first year just trying to understand the or appreciate the biophysical science and aspects of spatiotemporal data analysis through SWOT modeling or snowmelt runoff modeling in the Himalayan region. But I often used to ask myself that who's the audience for this science? How is this relevant for the residents of the region? For whom is this research being conducted? And for whom is this useful? So, to seek answers for that led me to move on to work with grassroots organizations like People Science Institute in Uttarakhand, where at some point I studied the impacts of run of the river hydropower projects in Bilangana sub-basin. Some of the photos of from that research, as you're seeing on the screen. And I was also a part of another large interdisciplinary team where I was studying the assessment of environmental flows from sociocultural perspective, but from also diverse perspectives in Ramganga Basin. Both Bilangana and Ramganga rivers are tributaries of Ganga Basin. So while working with both sets of diverse teams and engaging with these research topics during the extensive course of field research that lasted for about 2 years, I very quickly realized the complexity of the task at hand and learned the value of interdisciplinary engagement and of documenting or archiving the changes that ethnographers do as the landscape evolve very rapidly. Now, a few years down the line, uh, with the help of all of the wonderful collaborators and peer group, we have been able to create a space like Indian Youth Water Network where we're able to come together and understand different ways of knowing water or appreciate it. And I am personally very motivated to nurture such spaces more, to continue to maintain them, I suppose, as safe spaces where we could get together, drop our guards, and truly engage in the spirit of learning and knowledge seeking. I think that this will help in envisioning a different future or path for philosophy, science, and practice of water in India. Now, I say philosophy here because I believe that while doing sciences, we do the hard work of cleaning the data, conducting interviews, often creating maps, etc., or literature survey, or experiments. But philosophy comes in at a stage where we want to join dots across different disciplines. Perhaps we even call it interdisciplinarity in present times, to set the course for reimagining the future of water. So, after having done the science aspect for it for some basins so far, I'm personally really looking forward to this new style of relating with many more wonderful colleagues and collaborators within either IYWN or other existing networks, like the India Water Forums or Water Conflicts Forum in India, such that especially the young researchers and practitioners can come together to envision a different future of science and new ways of relating with how we understand water in India. So I think with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to engaging with all of you in the subsequent panel discussion.
So, thank you, Neha. Now we'll move to Tarun. Uh, Tarun is currently postdoctoral research associate in Living Delta Hubs Research Consortia at Newcastle University, where he is conducting field research program in Vietnam, Bangladesh, and India. So over to you, Tarun.
All right. So I'm Tarun, and I would be speaking a bit about what can we do in terms of research to protect and conserve our Himalayan rivers. So I'll start a bit with the complexity of it all. So we know that, or at least I've learned a bit from experience in the past, that systems are usually very interconnected and dynamic in nature, changing in space and time. India is one of the unique examples where this complexity is probably tenfold or even more in terms of when you include people and the social dimension in it. So this diagram you can see very nicely the presented the uh, from 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 a mouth of a river to its delta. Yeah, different things are happening over the course of the river. People are interacting with the river differently. It is facing different pressures, and this actually is a diagram which was produced keeping River Ganga in mind. So yeah, so it's I think it becomes very important to understand how socio-ecological systems are interacting with each other and within itself to see how a river is connected with everything around it. So just a quick idea about of some of the pressures that I've realized over the years on the upland rivers in India. And of course, we all know there's a major debate about hydropower at the moment, but that's just one of the facets of pressures that there is others that are less discussed, probably in research or media. Some are very top down effects of misinformed policy or over exploitation, corruption, to other which are more bottom up, like people are migrating from their remote hometowns towards cities, which is probably poverty driven. In essence, a lot of pressures exist on these systems, and therefore it becomes even more important to look towards their conservation and preservation in time. Um, where does science come in? Science has always been a medium to help policymaker understand what is of the utmost importance, and it's the same for rivers. So I personally feel that when I think about Himalayan rivers, I think that or any other ecosystem for that matter, that anything or research should be driven from ground up. So one should prioritize what is actually needed by these socio-ecological systems, the people, the river itself, and any science should be based on that as a base. So yeah, of course, we are lacking in proper research models as well that I've realized over the years. So a lot of key ecosystem processes are just probably copied from the West, and we don't really exactly understand if they are different or how different or what's the variability of those ecosystem processes. For example, how a river connects to its floodplain in the in Himalayas, and how is it different from other studies in the West mostly. And I believe to kind of enhance our knowledge or to go further with influencing the policy, I think the holistic frameworks are really the best options. So I've had a chance of working with some of the teams which were like proper interdisciplinary projects. Like one of them was where I met Neha, was on Ramganga River, studying environmental flows. And like Professor Joshi rightly mentioned in his intro, that holistic knowledge is the way forward, because like you cannot leave any aspect behind. So two quick concepts that I'm going to introduce is environmental flows and ecosystem services. So the first one is basically how much water does a river need to be healthy, let's say. So you have to study all the aspects of a river. River is just not a water body flowing in one direction that has fishes in it. It impacts a lot of other aspects like socio-cultural, religious beliefs of people. And then, of course, river has its own way of flowing. So it shrinks, it grows, so the geomorphology aspects come in. The other concept is services, where one sort of takes into account an ecosystem and how it works and functions, and basically we try to understand what do people derive from these processes and functions, directly and indirectly, and this helps already helps a policymaker, for example, to understand how is a particular process or function, how important is that for people, and what happens if it's lost, or what happens both in space and time with that process or function. So yeah, I think the future uh, in future we should focus on co-production of knowledge. I think IAYWN is a good platform for that, and where people from different disciplines are coming together now, and probably in future will have a chance to actually collaborate and do some science. Also co-learning. So uh, which would mean here that we actually interact with the locals, and we understand what pressures they're facing, and in terms and in turn what pressures their local water bodies are facing. So one has to step out and go out there and understand. I think Siddharth is doing some awesome work in that sense. So and then co-benefits, of course, we have to I believe it should be a two-way thing, and that not only science you know um, should be communicated to people, but also sorry, not just people should communicate to us, but science also should communicate to people what is important, and for the future. So making them aware about the services that are being indirectly probably offered to them by these water bodies or systems, and what will happen if these go away. So it should be a proper two-way communication. So yeah, so it's one of the photos that I have from the Ramganga visit. It's a fisherman had some interesting stories to share with us when we were on the field, and yeah. So I'll just end my talk here.
Thank you, Tarun.
Stop sharing. Yeah.
Thank you for the story. And now we understand that river has its own personality. And maybe now we can invite Rahul and listen to his perspective.
So thanks for having me. I would like to begin by thanking for being part of such an interesting panel. I'm Rahul Ranjan. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow. I'm part of a larger project called Riverine Rights, which basically looks at three different case study of three different countries, including New Zealand, India, and Colombia, where in 2017 different forms of legislative um, work had come around recognizing rivers, giving them a personality. So within my project, um, we have a large team of people, and I work within the project on Indian case study. So the project started with an intention to recognize that we've reached a point in the course of industrial growth where we are leaving huge footprints, anthropogenic footprints on natural environment. So the project was conceptualized by recognizing the need to respond to some of the great threats that are posed on natural landscape. But the idea of riverine rights actually comes from this legal fiction, which is called legal personhood, where we recognize certain corporations and now by extension natural environment, including rivers, as legal personalities. So the idea was conceptualized from an essay that was written in 1972, which is called Should Trees Have Standing? And which makes a compelling case for how we've reached stage where we start using these legal fiction to recognize the threat that we pose to environment in which we live in. So this essay became a formative step towards having discussion around rights to nature. So in 2008, Ecuador became the first country that legally recognized the rights of nature through constitutional amendment. And it laid upon certain rights and duties onto the river that was flowing through the country. So within our project, we have three case study, as I said, Colombia, India, and New Zealand. But each case study are very distinct and extremely difficult to handle. So I must give a caveat that it's an incipient framework in nature, as with any new emergent form of framework, but it has some transformative potential. So within the project, I'm asking three basic questions, and I've broadly framed them in three different disciplines. So the first question I ask within this project, and we've been doing this from last year, and we've done some research and have had some research output already. But within the political aspect of the judgment, so the judgment, I will introduce it in a minute, but we tend to look at what are the decisions, what led to the decision that declared these rivers as persons, and in identifying these political move, we look at different stakeholders who have interest in recognizing rights of the river, and does that conflict with other kinds of interests that are invested in, for instance, sand mining. And then we I try to map out how that conflict with existing legal framework. So once we recognize rivers as a living entity, what are the legal groundings that we use in order to foreground some of the claims that the nature can make in the court of law? And all of these things are based within larger social theory that we use in order to examine, that I could explain maybe in the Q&A. But we look at post-human approach, where we tend to recognize rights of environment as fundamentally important as rights of human. So to set a context to my presentation, in 2017, Uttarakhand High Court had passed two subsequent judgments, court orders recognizing first rights of Yamuna and Ganga, and then recognizing subsequently the rights of glaciers, which effectively meant that all the rivers that came out as forms of discharge and were part of these rivers were recognized as human beings. This was It's interesting because over past 1 year, some of my finding in doing intertextual legal reading have shown that some of the legal arguments are actually based on derivative forms of citation. So the judge, Rajiv Sharma, had drawn a lot on some of the legal precedents that are based in cases of Hindu idol, and not so much in terms of environmental litigation, which is extremely rich within Indian constitutional history. But these two judgments were very transformative because it introduced a new language to advocate for rights of river, which was not used so far. B, it also started to serve as a form of legal precedent, which means you can effectively use this as a form of an argument in making new forms of claims. Unfortunately, the both the judgments were put on stay by the Supreme Court of India, because the government of Uttarakhand took to the the Supreme Court, saying that there are certain federal disputes as what is a federal subject in India. But both of these judgment gives us opportunity to look very closely at what it means to think of river outside the immediate use-based value approach. And within this project, we try to use rights-based claim. But we also explore within this project, I am interested in discussions around climate change insofar that it helps me ask question from within the community. So one of the things I've been doing, and I'll be doing a long-term fieldwork now, starting late this year, is to look at the role of religious ecology, which is several ashram that are based by the bank, and how they mobilize community. What are the different methods they use in order for for mobilizing community for the restoration of river, and whether or not they use the language of rights at all. In the early spring this year, I've had a couple of interviews in Dehradun and around before COVID, and there was a general sense of dissatisfaction with using the language of rights to river, since these rivers are personified as or goddesses in India. So the language of law seems absent in the imagination of ordinary people. However, I've also had extensive interview with one of the person, MC Mehta, who was identified as a legal guardian to the river. And his responses were very interesting. That makes us think about what we should do. Other thing in this project I'm trying to do is to have a conversation with climate scientist and climate change researcher based in the West and in India who are working on rivers, by using some of the literary forms of a method. So I have a paper that's coming on, looking at how we can use the idea of grief memory in relation to rivers and also disaster. So what are the ways in which people use language as a form of negotiation in everyday life to relate with disaster that leave huge imprints of trauma on their life, and in what way does that inform us about rights of river? And this would lead us to, at least I assume that it would lead us to understand how there are different perception, use, and value of the river, and then contrast that with highland cartographic imagination, which basically means people living in upper Himalayan region consuming these rivers, and being exposed to this knowledge about rights to river, as opposed to those who live in lower basin area. And what does that tell us about this entire framework that is very incipient right now? Recently, we also had a piece out where we looked at, which is called Where Ordinary Law Falls Short. And we tried to look at these three different countries, and it's co-written with lawyers, anthropologists, I'm an anthropologist, political scientist, and we found out that there is substantial body of conversation going all around in the world, and seems to suggest that there is a transnational emergent form of response within the law in terms of use of language to defend rights of rivers in particular, because that's my area of interest, but environment in general. And I find it very interesting that within India we both have language, but we also have a very strong and rich reserve of knowledge within the history of litigation in the courts, fighting for rights of the nature. I'd just stop here, and most welcome to ask questions.
Thank you, Rahul. I think that was like a very different perspective. Many of us might not have been aware of all this, and I have wondered that whether if we have rights and we can like go to courts and appeal for if our right has been infringed, but a river cannot do it. So thank you for the talk. Next, we will move to Siddharth. Sorry, Rahul, I just forgot to introduce you, but I will not make the same mistake for Siddharth. So let me read it out. Siddharth has been walking across India along rivers, trying to document and bring stories of marginalized people and the environment into the mainstream. His organization, Veditam India Foundation, hosts some of his work along with efforts towards environmental research, documentation, and accountability initiatives. So, over to Siddharth now.
Thank you, Dr. Divya. Let me just share my screen. I think you might have to use the backup because this needs some permissions that need me to quit the app and come back in. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Apologies for this mix-up, but I'll just start off by saying that we're talking about breaking silos, and while we're talking about interdisciplinary work and breaking of silos in that manner, we also have to think about other silos that need to be broken. It's not just cross discipline, but it's also geographical and often of nation state. And I really like the fact that Dr. Rahul talked about it in his presentation, that there is a developing language that is trying to extend beyond the definition of the nation state as we start working on more issues in the Indian Himalayas. And another important silo that I think we should be aware of when thinking about water research for the Himalayas is that our because of the way the nation state is defined, our mountains are not distinct from our plains. A lot of what happens in the plains defines how things happen in the mountains. Whether it's about need or whether it's about luxury, both define what happens in the mountains. So that silo also needs to be broken, and we communicate both ways instead of just being driven by what is needed in the plains. And I think that's very crucial for us to think about when we think about research in the Himalayas. Can we go to the next slide? So there's this organization called Veditam that I run, and a project called Moving Upstream that is hosted at Veditam, where we walk along rivers in India, trying to document stories of the river and the riparian community. While the river is our thread, it has helped us to go into other factors, into other attributes that affect the life of people who live around it. So from the river, we went on to discuss about water quality for people. From the river, we went on to discuss about agriculture and issues of agriculture that people face, about the rights of indigenous people, Adivasis in India, and how their rights are connected. And this one thread allowed us to go on and look at a lot of things. So because this is sort of aimed at early career researchers, the idea that we can start looking at one thread and then we can expand from there. Can we go next? Yeah, so just to give you a sense about the kind of silos that I was talking about, the continuity, like I walked along the Ganga, which transcends both the plains as well as the mountains. I think that kind of an imagination has to be built in as we move forward with our research, while we look at the picture as a whole and not in isolation. Yeah, can we go to the next one? And I had added a slide later on, but basically, from all the things that we've talked about till now, including breaking of silos, including sharing of information and data between practitioners, there is an essential component of communication. And that communication has to be in so many different ways. And it does not have to be only to people who will make policies, but people whose lives we are talking about. If you think about us as practitioners, so while we are taking information from the ground, from people and their lives and landscapes, how do we bring that information back? From the walk along the Ganga that I had done, we produced a documentary called Moving Upstream Ganga, which talks about the issues that people have highlighted about the river, about their lives related to the river, and a lot of other things that are part of their lives, not necessarily about the river. But the attempt was to simplify and communicate. And that I think is going to be a major challenge, especially with increasing issues of climate change, with increasing issues of fragility that we are seeing in the Indian Himalayas and across landscapes, but especially with the Indian Himalayas. This last week, last month, we have seen so much fragility, but we've often seen this through the lens of news items. We need to do the work of communication, of decoding that, and then taking it to people who are not practitioners, people who are not, the folks who are very aggressively interested in this. And the last one, I think, next slide. Yeah. So I just wanted to leave everyone with this image, which is from the Tehri Dam in Uttarakhand, Tehri Dam Reservoir, which has a series of luxury boats in the middle that you can see floating. And I bring this here because of the first point that I had made regarding breaking of silos and the interconnectedness of landscape. This decision of making the Tehri Dam is actually driven by Delhi. Without focusing on what is happening in Delhi, we cannot change anything that's happening to our mountains or the Himalayas. So that interconnectedness, that silo breaking has to happen on so many levels. And while this is also daunting, I think this is also an incredible opportunity for us to work together as different kinds of researchers and practitioners to come together and understand this, share information across different practices, and also do the communication work that is required, because eventually policy will be driven by what people want. So we will have to focus on that aspect as well. Yeah, thank you. I'll stop there, and if there are questions, I can take them later.
Thank you, Siddharth. I think yes, that we have talked about demystifying science. So maybe making movies and like these kind of communication is required to even if it's science driven people, we have to like take it to people also and to policymakers. I think that is really important. Thank you for that uh, presentation. Now we'll move to Rinan next. So let me introduce her. Rinan is a PhD candidate at Ashoka Trust of Research and Ecology and the Environment. Her areas of interest encompasses environment and development in a political economic context. And I think over to you, Rinan. I'll put rest of the bio in chat so that you can like present your work.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Divya and all the organizers as well as Neha for coming up with this concept of looking at the future of water research for the Himalaya. I would just like to mention. I think we'll be drawing a lot from what the others before me have said. So, as Siddharth mentioned, when I was preparing this presentation, there was continuous flow of information coming in from what the rainfalls had done. I think it was the heaviest rainfall in October since the last 50 years. The last one was around 1968. So this was a reminiscent or a memory for a lot of the older folks. So yeah, that was the setting in which I was writing this presentation down. So I'm Rinan, and I'm from Bijanbari, the place that you see on your screen on your left. It's a valley located in the eastern Himalayan region. And also, I would like to acknowledge this opportunity as a privilege where many of the mountain people have most likely been unable to make. With such spaces opening up, we can clearly see that the future of water research for the Himalaya is working towards inclusivity of the researched themselves. For this panel, there have been multiple thoughts running through my head, but I would like to focus on three aspects that are visible silos. Most of my insights I'm going to draw from my field work on domestic water scarcity that I do in the town of Darjeeling, which you see on your right. The three silos or the three aspects that I would like to focus on are the compatibility between research, policy, and education, disciplinary silos, and regional research. Many of us on the panel are aware of the incompatibility between research, policy, and education. I would also like to mention that what I discuss might not be novel, but the fact that it has to be brought up time and again highlights the not so successful attempts at making it happen. Research, policy, and education need to drive and support each other. The lag in acceptance and implementation is a given, but could we, in a way, attempt to make these times shorter? One of the lag, not a particular lag, but what the differences are between when we talk about the mountain states, but you're talking to a person from the plains, and this is from experience because a lot of people do not know how mountain towns are. So you have to create a visualization for people probably at Delhi, as Siddharth mentioned. Moving forward, well, an example of the discrepancy or the lag between research policy and education could be brought in by looking at springs, which are the major water sources of the mountainous regions, and of course the Himalayan region. These are what the people are dependent on, but the policies have only as recently as into 2018 been built to look at it. Uh, the fact that they are groundwater sources and the relationship to surface water and others are yet to be made, and policies such as Million Wells program, etc., which are created, they clearly cannot be taken up in the hills, and these seem to be missing in the policies at the national level also as well as state level, depending on how your state, if your state is entirely a mountain town or not. I also feel all the three aspects that I have been discussing are majorly driven by willingness of the researchers, willingness of the policymakers, and the students themselves. Disciplinary silos becomes more and more evident as we specialize in our work. The silos are in terms of disciplines which drive your methods, your nature of data used, analysis, as well as the philosophy of the subject themselves. A little push in the pedagogy is needed. We clearly do not need everyone to do everything. But what would be of immense help is the space we make for each other with water as a focus. The studies taken up on the Himalaya are still boxed into very traditional disciplines of the natural sciences or the engineering or the social sciences. I'm certain that if we start listening and learning from and talking to people in general working on the Himalaya, our work would be enhanced. Another instance here about data and information, because that's what is primary for all of us, is that there is a lack in some cases in on the information from the Himalaya, and they are sometimes very hard to come by. And the reasons are too many to be discussed here. What has worked for me is looking for places where people have spoken about it, be it literature, be it history or anthropology, and the like, and the like. So I think one major thing is we should not leave people out, as I think Dr. Rahul Ranjan had mentioned in one of his talks, that mountains have too long been seen as a world without people. Next, moving on to the regional research. James Scott, in his book *The Art of Not Being Governed*, had mentioned how in the hilly regions the altitudinal differences are much more than horizontal differences. This implies that the mountain people living at same altitudes tend to have more similarities than someone located a few hundred meters above or below them. This does create a kind of similarity across the Himalaya and across the major mountains of the world. Unfortunately, what is common among us all is also marginalization, inaccessibility, and fragility. This understanding is needed for any research that is being carried out in the Himalaya. The diversity across Himalaya is not only it's evident, but it's not only in terms. So I think it depends on how you are, what your discipline is, because sometimes you might see the Himalaya as an entire unit, or if you are a little more specific on the biophysical, you might see it as the Western Himalaya, the Central Himalaya, or the Karakoram. And depending on if you are driven by some political research, you might look at it from administrative boundaries. In spite of these differences, what I wanted to say is all of them are intertwined to make issues around water much more layered. That's why statements such as, why aren't you people doing anything about your water issues, I think need to come from a place where, there is an understanding of these myriad issues. Uh, Lastly, I would like to say that, everyone should not do everything on understanding water issues, but we should all have a willingness to learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Rinan. I think we will all agree that we have to come together. There are layers. So I think all of us represent one layer of the problem. So coming together here itself will break that silo itself. That the understanding of every layer is different, like from a political view or from a geomorphological view. So thank you for the talk. Now we'll move to Manish next. Manish works at the interface of climate, forest, and water in Indian Himalayan region, with emphasis on springs and stream hydrology, and draws skill sets from the discipline of hydrology, ecology, hydrometeorology, and hydrogeology. So over to you, Manish.
Yes, thank you for inviting me to the panel. Hearing people hear the diversity of views here is quite enriching, and I hope I can contribute to that. I am a PhD student at A3, also a consultant with International Water Management Institute. Been working on springs since probably 2008. I'm not a hydrologist. With an ecology background, I think my eyes opened to water in Himalayas in 2008 almost by accident, and since then I've been working on water issues in Himalayas. And as we know, just for the background sake, we know that Himalayas has the problem of excess of water, where we get too much water, as we saw probably last week, and we have water scarcity. And if Siddharth, I can link to Siddharth's presentation, he was showing the Tehri Dam. This image of tankers and people lining up next to the tankers in the hills is the road next to the Tehri Dam. So you have a full body of water which is supplying electricity to Delhi, but you don't have water for the people nearby. Probably also because a lot of springs that were there in the region, on which people were dependent, dried up while there was tunneling going on for the dam, and which leads me to the key problem in Himalayas. And we know that with the IPCC and everything talks about the glacial melt and how the glaciers are disappearing in the Himalayas. I think the key problem is also that the springs are disappearing in Himalayas. The springs are the primary sources of water here, and there has been a massive or widespread reporting of decline. There's of course no information, like documented information, but it is in public perception. It's a quite well-known phenomena that the springs are either declining in numbers or declining in their discharge. Springs, as we know, are one of the first units of groundwater. In that way, they are one of the first units of water in Himalayas, especially in the Himalayas in which people live. The glacial and the higher Himalayan region excluding. Springs are first point at which water comes out, the groundwater comes out in the surface where the water table intersects. And many springs come together to combine to form streams, the small streams, and these small streams combine together to form some of the tributary rivers, and the tributary rivers combine provide water to rivers like Ganga or Yamuna, the main water bodies in India. And in that sense, springs can be seen as, like, there are studies which report almost as high as 30 to 40% contribution of groundwater to major rivers in India, especially in the lean season. Which means that the interventions that are done at local level, which is, if a spring is rejuvenated, it has implications not only at the local level but also at regional level. This is the second image of tanker next to the Tehri Dam, and there is a drying spring. So what we were talking about was basically that springs are groundwater units, and intervention that are done at spring scale have implications at regional as well as transnational scales. Springs are also bodies which are not just affected by the groundwater or like the underground phenomena, but also overground phenomena, including there is a strong influence of vegetation on springs, which means that the way of understanding a spring lies not only through hydrogeology, which is the ground science of groundwater or water chemistry, but also eco-hydrology, which is a way of understanding the influence of land use and forests on water bodies. And thus impact of vegetation, especially how different type of forest influence springs, is a critical issue. But we don't have data. Like, where is the data? How many springs are there? Some say there are 10 million springs in Himalayas. There are 1500, actually 15,000 springs which are formally inventorized, and this is also just a rough number. And as we can see, there's a map that we produced for a report that we are producing for Niti Aayog. Most springs that are enumerated in the Himalayas are from Uttarakhand or Sikkim, and the rest of the Himalayas there is very little information. Again, a rough number, there are probably less than 200 or probably 300 springs which are being monitored by people manually in terms of their discharge or water quality in the Himalayas. And I'm talking about whole Himalayas here. And I think there are less than 50 springs which are under research, and current or old combining together. Very few springs are there which we are actually monitoring in terms of long-term understanding of how these systems work. To show some of that initiatives, this is one of the springs that we instrumented in 2013, and I think along with Dr. Sumit Sen from IT Roorkee, his instrumentation in Uttarakhand, this in Sikkim was one of the first instrumentation of springs itself, where we were putting up instruments to measure the discharge of a spring in a very high resolution, like every 10 minutes or a minute level data. This another spring in South Sikkim that we were monitoring. This is the third spring, and these are not very high cost systems, costing around 30 to 40,000 maybe. We're putting up rain gauges also to understand how these springs behave with rainfall. Interestingly, this spring and the rain gauge got discontinued because there were instances of theft and all that, and we lost a lot of information. We thought, can we use remotely sensed data or gridded data as a substitute? Which led me to understanding, this is one of the papers we published of understanding how gridded data works in Himalayas, and it is not very great with the complex terrain and the kind of hydrometeorological systems that we have. The remotely sensed data is not good enough to provide information or to be useful for modeling at a local or a regional scale, or at a local scale. Regional scale maybe. The experience from Sikkim led us to collaborating with civil society organizations in Uttarakhand to develop similar instrumentations, where civil society organization staff was trained to instrument and monitor and gather data. We did workshops with them to understand what the data looks like, how do you make sense of what the information is coming out. It also led to the understanding that it is you can have as much as data you can, and you can get involve people to gather data for you, but ultimately you're doing it for your own selfish sense, to publish papers and get your PhDs out of it. It is important that the communities that are helping you maintain those sites or gather that data also understand these systems. And that led to the earlier somebody mentioned about demystifying science, and that led me to the idea of that the science of groundwater also needs to be demystified to a level where communities understand their own systems well. These two images were something that I saw in this year March, where I was visiting a village in Garhwal, where this women group was basically they were chugging huge chunks of brick and rocks and different type of rocks, so that they can build something like this. In the second image, this is a model of a spring, which shows both the soil as well as different type of rocks that are there, which govern those springs. And this was supposed to be a working model, which these people can then use to explain other communities that are coming to their place. This is a very great example of communities like scientists and practitioners helping communities understand science, and then communities translating that science to other people around them. And I think this is one of the win-wins that we should be striving for. The another great example was looking at something called Dhara Janpatri, which can be loosely translated to a spring horoscope, which was basically like a document that the village community was maintaining, which was recharging this particular spring, where they were putting all the information related to a spring in one place for their own usage, monitoring, they were putting up discharge data as well as water quality data here, but also to tell other people who are visiting them, like other communities that come to see what they have done, to be able to explain to them what is happening. Now, this is another good example where data can help communities also earn money, because when we go to them and we say we gather information and we do our own sciences, they are left with nothing. They give their time, they give their expertise, their information to us, but they don't gain from this. So we started on basically a mechanism of paying them back, that whenever we come to you, we will give something which can go to your Samiti fund, which can be used for monitoring or any other sort of implementation use for the spring. This is one of the ways the science and community can interact with each other, where both benefit each other. I think researchers going in field and putting up their stations and hoping that those stations will work in Himalayas is not happening. I think these 2 days of rainfall would have washed away most of the stations that are there in the place. And the researcher can't go sitting from Roorkee or Dehradun to these interior villages. The community will go and will see there, but they have to be incentivized, and uh, that will go a long way in ensuring that we have long-term monitoring sites in this place. The long-term monitoring sites will provide the data that is going to be useful for developing models. The models that can tell you what happens to these springs if with climate change impact, if there's going to be more rain, less rain, if there's going to be warming, if the vegetation is changing, so on and so forth. So on the experience, the point of sharing this experience is to highlight that the silos of researchers working in their institutes and pushing out their papers, and communities struggling with their daily needs in a village have to break if they have to communicate to each other, and it has to be a win-win. It cannot be just a one-way benefit transfer. Thank you. I hope I have not overshot.
Thank you, Manish. That was a great presentation and putting out everything so clearly that the community should also benefit from us. It should not be just one way that we are getting data from there and we are not able to give or communicate the science behind whatever we have gathered back to them so that they can benefit for that. So from that. So thank you, Manish. Now we'll move to Professor Ashutosh. Dr. Ashutosh is an assistant professor at the Department of Hydrology in IIT Roorkee and is interested in interdisciplinary research and teaching to understand hydro-climatological process and their connections to the natural human world. So now over to Professor Ashutosh.
Yeah. Thank you, Divya. Let me share my screen. Can you please confirm if you can see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much for introducing me. Well, I'm from Himachal, but unfortunately, I have not done much as maybe some of the other panelists to preserve the water sources or solve the problems in the Himalayas. I am a hydrologist who sit in the office most of the times, goes to site sometimes, but mostly I'm sitting in my offices and doing the hydrology. So, as far as it comes to having the knowledge about the sites, maybe I know very less compared to other of the panelists that we have here. So my presentation will be more of a view of a hydrologist on the climate change impacts in the Himalayan regions. I will not go into the details, but I will be highlighting that what are the things that we know and what could be the future direction of the research in the Himalayas. So we know that Himalayas are massive mountain systems which are highly complex in terms of biodiversity, hydro-climatology, ecology, or elevation patterns. And sorry, Rinan, I think I copied your image here. You also showed this image. So the Himalayan glaciers are also called tower of Asia, and because these are the sources to many of the world's great rivers, including Ganga, Indus, Brahmaputra in India, Yangtze, and Mekong in the northern side of the Himalayas. And over 1 billion people we know that depend on these mountains, on the Himalayas for survival. Therefore, the region is very important for us to ensure the water and food security. At the same time, it is estimated that a large portion of India's hydropower electricity production capacity is located in the plains of these rivers, which means any variability in the flow patterns over the Himalayan regions can have far-reaching consequences in terms of energy security of the country. We also understand that these regions are ecologically sensitive because there are a large number of glaciers which are highly vulnerable to any changes in the climate. And it has been observed that Himalayan systems have a different or unique response to climate change, which provides us both opportunity as well as challenge. Opportunity in the way that as these systems are the very first, for example, it is believed that the glaciers or the ice system, they are the very first which respond to the changes in the climate. So we have an opportunity if we can understand the response of these systems to these climatic changes, then we can make better adaptation policies for climate change challenges. I think Manish already talked in detail that getting data in Himalayan systems is a major challenge. Not only climate change, but there are many issues. For example, like the diversity of Himalayan systems that we are talking about. There are a diverse number of problems that we are facing in these issues. Over past few days, we already discussed in detail how climate change is affecting changing precipitation patterns, melting of snow, melting of glaciers, or it is changing the runoff patterns. But at the same time, I think we should also consider the other issues which are there in these regions to ensure the food, water, and energy security. For example, let's take the example of pollution. The black carbon deposits which are originating from factories or vehicles, they are compounding the effects of the climate change. They are accelerating the impact of climate change, and further they're accelerating the melting of the Himalayan glaciers. Earthquakes, they also pose a major threat in terms of increasing the possibility of occurrence of massive landslides or globe events. In the forest areas, we face forest fire in these regions every year. Now, all of these events, what they do, they not only have impact. For example, forest fire, they do not have impact only on forest, but they also influence the hydrological response of the basins which are there in these regions. And it is important for us that we analyze these issues together rather than particularly focusing on one of these issues. For example, over exploitation of the land resources for agriculture or urbanization is also altering the hydrological response of these systems. Excessive groundwater extractions or the tunneling and some other vibrations which are produced while we are constructing dams in the Himalayan regions, they are leading to the drying of the springs. So it is important that all of these factors, they are not studied independently, but we shift our focus where we study the compound effect of these factors to ensure the food, water, and energy security in the region. Lastly, I just want to show that from a hydrologist perspective, that what are the things that we lack and what could be the future possibilities or future directions of the research in hydrology. For For example, although we have done a lot of advancements in the recent past in the field of hydrology or in the field of understanding the global climate system, but we still lack a clear understanding of the microclimate systems which are present in the Himalayan regions. If you see, after every hazard, we start looking for the reasons. We do not really understand what are the different driving factors of hydrological responses in Himalayan systems. Our understanding, for example, our understanding of the role of terrestrial ecosystems, vegetations in maintaining the quality and quantity of water is also very limited. I think something Manish already told, that we should focus more on analyzing that how these vegetation systems, they are interacting with the hydrological systems, and how we can manage these systems in a better way, how we can provide more of nature-based solutions. Now, most of this lack of our understanding can be attributed to the lack of data. We do not have very good data, which is a well-known fact. But in the recent past, obviously, many new technologies have come up where now we can get some data from remote sensing. Still, the reliability of that data is of question. Now, coming to the next point, which is something that again we are lacking, is the good knowledge of uncertainty. In the recent past, although we have put a lot of stress on understanding the uncertainty in the future climate projections, where we talk about the uncertainty of the climate models, but I think we should also focus on the uncertainties which are coming from the observations or from the lack of our understanding of the system. For example, we use hydrological models which are developed in the West. We directly apply those models to the Himalayan systems. Now, many of times these models may not be very well suited for those applications. So this is something that I think as a researcher we should focus more on, that how whether those tools that we are using, they are really solving our problem, or whether they are adding more of uncertainty in the solutions that we are getting. Next 3 points is something which obviously other members of the panel, they know more about it rather than me. I just want to club these 3 points together. We clearly lack a communication channel where we can discuss the research that we are doing with the communities or with the stakeholders. And I consider that this is actually could be, if we can implement something where we can create a communication channel between communities, between stakeholders and the researchers, then that would be a win-win situation for everyone. For example, we as hydrologists, we can learn from the local knowledge, we can learn from the local communities on how the particular systems, hydrological systems in a particular area have behaved in the past, and that is something that we can further incorporate into our analysis to strengthen the models or to strengthen the analysis that we are doing. At the same time, as we have some scientific knowledge, we can use that knowledge to provide the solutions to the problems which are there in the ground. So I think it is very important that there exists a communication channel through which all the stakeholders, all the communities which are living there, and the researchers like me who basically sit in their offices, do the modeling part, they can communicate so that we can improve or solve each other's problem. Now, on the right side of this slide, I have written some points which I think could be a future directions of research in the hydrology. So I have split this into 2 parts. First is improving the traditional approach. So traditionally we have been doing modeling, we have been taking the observations, we have been studying different aspects of hydrological response. So one thing that we can do is to try to improve it further, which can be basically done by either improving our models, expanding the observation network to get more and more data so that we can build better models, we can have better projections of future, or we can learn more about the uncertainties which are there in these models. But at the same time, I think there is a need to shift the paradigm where we talk more of multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. For example, if you see this figure at the center, it shows the different spheres within the Earth system. Now we have hydrosphere, atmosphere, biosphere, lithosphere, cryosphere. Now on Earth, all of these spheres they interact with each other. I may be a hydrologist, I may specialize in hydrology, but that does not mean that I can ignore what is going on in the other spheres. So there's a need that we consider the hazards which are happening in different spheres together, and we talk of compound hazards, how hazard in hydrology is influencing the hazards which are there, let's say in biosphere, or how cryosphere hazards there, like globes, they're interacting with hydrosphere, atmosphere. So I think there is a need where we start talking more about compound and cascading hazards rather than focusing on our own domains. Next point I have written here is nature-based solutions. Now, engineering has obviously revolutionized the world. Engineering has provided many solutions to the world, but not everything can be effectively solved with engineering. There are some things, some problems which can be solved more effectively if we use the nature. For example, we still do not have very good understanding of how the vegetation and terrestrial ecosystems they control the quantity as well as quantity of the water in the river systems. Now, if we can improve our understanding of these interactions between natural systems and some of the ecosystem services that we are interested in then I think we can use the nature to solve the problems that we have. So I think there's a need that we shift our focus rather than looking at the engineering for each of the solution, but to see that whether we can use nature itself to solve a particular problem. And further, obviously, I think in the last few days we have been discussing a lot about socio-hydrology, participatory science. Dr. Kulkarni stressed a lot about on the participatory science where we need to make the communities participate in the science, where we bring them on the same table, we discuss with them the solutions that we have, we ask them their problems, and many times we will find that they already know the solutions, although they do not know the science as we know. They may not know the terms that we use in the scientific papers, but they will be, most of the time we will find that they are already aware of the solutions. And that is something that we as a researchers can obviously learn from them. We can include it in our models, in our analysis, and then we can all come together at this common platform and try to solve the problems. So I think that is all from my side. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Ashutosh. Thank you very much. Now we'll quickly move to our next panelist, Kavita.
Hi.
Hi, I'll just briefly introduce Kavita. Kavita is a journalist and researcher who writes at the intersection of politics and environment in Indian Himalayan region. Having worked with two of the India's most prominent newspaper, the Hindu and the Indian Express, she currently works independently. So over to you, Kavita.
Thank you so much. So, thank you for inviting me here. I think it's very good that I am the last speaker because everything that other speakers have said, it kind of comes together in journalism because these are the people I would talk to ask them, or specialists in different fields, to ask them if something happens in the Himalayas, to what do you think really happened in the climate, what happened in hydrology, all those things. But before talking to these specialists, I would go to the ground. I would talk to people, which is also very important. You have to go to the ground, you have to talk to people and know the ground realities of a situation before you move to experts. So, speaking of breaking silos, I think in journalism it works well because we do talk to multiple people to understand something better. And for doing that, we have to, as a journalist, you have to know those many things also to be able to ask the right questions, to approach the right people. So, I think journalism is where people also start to understand issues. For example, if there were rains in Uttarakhand, you'd first read news articles because research papers will come later. So, for a journalist to know different aspects of something, to be able to approach the right people, to ask the right questions, to write a better story, is important to first personally break silos. So, I don't have a presentation here, but I'll be speaking about my own experience in the Himalayan region. So I've worked as a journalist for like 9 years now, and mostly in the Himalayan region, Uttarakhand, Himachal, etc. And for the past year, I've also been into research. So my journey with this topic of breaking silos started when I was studying engineering, because in the engineering lectures, I felt, so I studied electronics and communication, and we used to sit in the class and we never spoke about the people or the ecology or the environment that a technology is going to impact. We only always spoke about the technology, or we were only taught about that. Our exams were conducted around those things. So I felt sitting in those lectures that there was this huge gap. We didn't know who this technology was going to impact, what were the ground realities. So that's where I thought I needed to study journalism also, because I needed to know more about my own region. and what happens on the ground, like how a nala is built in a locality. I didn't know, because when you go from school to college, you sometimes don't know the ground realities of things. So I thought, okay, journalism would be a place to bridge a lot of gaps. So I studied journalism after engineering, and that opened up so many sectors for me and so many ways of understanding. I would interact with politicians, to somebody working in education, to somebody working on the environment, to people impacted by, let's say, infrastructure projects. Kedarnath disaster was the first assignment that I covered for the Hindu. So looking at all those things together, where corruption and environment and people's own woes come together, and politics, so that all these areas opened up for me. And over the years of working in the Himalayan region, I realized how water is so important to the lives of our people. I am a Himalayan resident myself. So I realized how the abundance of water in high rainfall, if it's a scenario of high rainfall, or if there is lack of water, if there are drying springs, how all those things impact our lives. And I was really interested in this area. So then I went on to do my master's in water science policy and management. So my own journey has been of breaking silos and to understand different things, so that at least when I'm writing something for the readers, I can I can ask the right questions, I can write things holistically and look at them holistically, the issues I'm writing about. So that's personal. So for example, over the on 18th and 19th of October, we saw heavy rains, and my district, Nainital district, was the most impacted in Uttarakhand. More than 500 millimeter rainfall recorded at various places. This is when we don't even have apparatus to to actually measure rainfall at so many other places. So we don't even know whether this was it, or whether rainfall even exceeded beyond 550 millimeter. We don't know that. So in this scenario, for me, being a resident living in the Himalaya, my own personal experience is very important in my work, because that also plays a part in me trying to ask the right questions. Second, my own understanding of water, water management, issues around climate, disasters, that comes into play. Then the people I will ask the questions to, my when I visit the ground, what all do I want to know? Do I just want to know about how many people died, what buildings got damaged, or do I want to go beyond that? So my own experience in breaking silos to expand my own understanding of the areas I work in is important. So that's where I think breaking silos personally comes into play, where you want to know more and more about your area of work, so that you can ask the right questions at least, and then produce better work. Second, I would come to the point of breaking silos, within the area of work in the Himalaya. For example, so there were floods in February in Chamoli, February 7. So 53 experts from over 10 countries, from hydrologists to geologists to hydrogeologists to people working on disasters, seismologists, different people came together to write about what really happened that caused the Chamoli floods, what happened up there in the mountains, and then what happened down near the hydropower projects, where we saw more than 200 deaths. So, from what happened, what caused the floods, to what happened downstream, it was so it helped having 53 experts on board. It firstly shortened the time of research, so we could produce a good paper. It was published in Science, the journal, and we could produce a very good paper. We finished everything in a month. So the time of research reduced, so we could produce that research in a shorter period of time. Because if you work independently, then you take that much more time, because you have to invest that much more individual time to bring out some work, right? And then having different experts also helped, because then we could bring in so many experiences together and bring out a holistic paper as much as was possible. So that was an example for me in understanding how professionally you break silos, and how it is possible to actually come together, bring different expertise together, and bring out a piece of work that will at least expand and make better the understanding of something that happened, let's say in case of a disaster. And then personally for me, since I've been working in Uttarakhand for quite some time, I knew the villagers who are going to go to the courts. against hydropower projects, let's say. So I could personally communicate to them that, see, this is the paper that has come out. You can use it, the information that we found, and you can go to court with it. If you can use it as an important document to strengthen your case. So I would just conclude by saying that when it comes to breaking silos, for me, it is at two levels always. One is personally, that you have to always keep expanding your own understanding of things, so that even to collaborate with people, you know who it is that you could get in touch with, whose expertise would come handy to expand your understanding of a certain issue. That helps in journalism. And second is when you professionally collaborate with different people who are working in different sectors, so that you can bring out a piece of work which has inputs of experts working in different areas who are trying to understand one specific aspect. For example, in if Nainital, high rains have happened in Nainital, or if our lake overflowed, or if there were landslides in my town, then collaborating with different people who are working on urban infrastructure, to climate change, to somebody working on meteorology, so that is very important if we want to break silos personally and professionally. That'll be all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavita. I think that, like the way you said, it's a two-way thing, that we have to break our own silos, and then we have to come together to to do a research which is not isolated and which can be usable to most of us, like for the community, for the scientists, and for the policymakers. So thank you for that. And Professor Joshi, if you want to say a few words, then we'll have a we have questions for the panelists.
Thank you, Divya. I think the presentations and the talks and the words which have been all presented by the distinguished panelists have been actually self-explaining in all the respects, and they have really provided various perspectives and a kind of real down to earth kind of situation, that what is presently needed. So what we really need is that we certainly need to heed to the kind of suggestions at all levels. So, and the last speaker, when I think she summed up in a wonderful way that we have to break two forms of silos: one our within as well as then external. So in both ways, if we are able to do it, I think it will be something great. We got perspectives from law, from journalism, from various types, and I think it has been really wonderful. And maybe we need to learn. We need to keep learning and understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I have a question for the panelists. It's open for everyone, just to take the discussion forward. So even I have been trained as an engineer, and I understand that for an engineer there is an urge to solve problem, versus sometimes patience is required to to engage with the problem and to understand it holistically. So I'm just curious, how do you think that these two aspects can come together? You have to solve problems because water is needed, and you have to create structures and all those places where you need data to to create a solution. But now there is another aspect where you have to first dig deeper into the problem itself. So I would like to ask maybe first Professor Ashutosh, if you can reflect on that.
Sure. So I think, as you mentioned, and I was also mentioning in my talk, that obviously engineering solutions are one aspect of when it comes to solving the problems. Obviously, in many cases, we need engineering. We need our engineering knowledge of solving the problems. But engineering is something which came like it, which really started in last only 1 or 2 centuries, 2 3 centuries. Before that, people survived, they solved their problems, and these disasters, floods, and all, they were there. It's not like floods just started right now. There are many indigenous methods of solving the problems. For example, as I talked about nature-based solutions, where we do not really need engineering to solve a problem, but we can use some indigenous knowledge, some local knowledge, which was there, which people have been using to solve some problems. And there we will find that we not only solve problem, but we have many other advantages. in many cases, engineering solution to a problem will lead to another problem. For example, we do not have electricity, we create dams. Now, dams are causing some problems. But if we see the historical way, the indigenous way of solving the problems, there people could find a sustainable solution where although they could solve the problem, but at the same time they would ensure that this do not lead to some other problems. So I think there is a need that we use this local knowledge, we look at the indigenous knowledge that we have, and especially for a country like India, where we talk about Vedas, we talk about ancient texts that we have, and we say that those texts had the solution to everything. I'm not sure whether it's true or not, but I think it would be a good perspective where we start looking more into those ancient knowledge that we have and try to solve problem rather than restricting ourselves to the engineering solutions
Yeah.
that we obviously study in
Right. Right.
colleges.
Thank you so much. Siddharth, would you want to reflect on that? You are
Yeah,
also have a engineering background, right? Now you are walking the river.
right.
So how do you
Yeah,
think that? How is the two mindsets?
right. I think my engineering background is quite different. It's not even civil engineering. It's like rocket
Okay.
science. So it's not what others have probably studied in civil engineering. But I think two things on the question that you've asked in terms of this urgency to solve something, as well as this need to take longer times to collect data and then reflect on that. I will pick up on what Rinan had said in her presentation. We don't need to do everything ourselves, and that is where this breaking silo will really help us. That there are people who are working on solutions. As someone who needs to work on a larger time frame, we can take the step back and let them work and help them when they are executing the work. So I think it just speaks again to the idea of breaking silos, that
Right.
we don't need to do everything alone. There are people who are uh, positioned and ready to do certain kind of work which is urgent. That may not be us. So I think that understanding, and just one more thing to add is that I've learned while doing this work and from others in the civil society sector in India, is that often we go with solutions or ideas in our head to communities. We need to instead start asking them what do they want. That would also solve a lot of this crisis that we have of, oh, we should urgently implement this, whereas asking them, okay, is there a need of intervention? Do you even feel the need? There's
Right.
no need to like necessarily just intervene just because we can.
Right.
So yeah, I'll pass it on to other speakers.
Thank you. So anyone else want to comment, or maybe if Neha, you have a question. If anybody else want to comment on this, like how to, there is a dichotomy in and like being solution oriented and then first understanding the problem itself. Sometimes you want the solution like a little faster than maybe understanding the problem itself. So if
Just to add
yeah,
here, if I
Manish,
can.
yes, yeah, yeah,
I think
please.
day for yesterday, Dr. Kulkarni mentioned something about action research, and I think that is a term that has been there for ages.
Yeah,
But as with any utopia, it's one of the hardest thing to go around with. We tried working with, there's a consortium that we work with at Chirag, where one of the photographs I was showing, where we tried to provide them real-time knowledge. The problems were coming from them that look, this we have to recharge the springs. How can you help us? And we were looking at long-term how springs behave, hydrological modeling, and all that. It doesn't always succeed, but in terms of idea, it's a sound theory. I think action research could be one of the ways in which ground informs you the real problems, and researchers can take it up in a longer run while helping with short-term solutions, or not short-term solutions, but basically key insights into what works and what doesn't work, or what can be looked up where, sort of a thing. So yeah, that's one point. Action research could be one of the buzzwords with this.
yeah,
Divya, I just have one point.
yes,
Uh, One thing which I certainly feel, because we have all gathered here from different segments and we do have our own experiences. Actually, we need to these kinds of discussions or deliberations are actually extremely important, no doubt about it. But we need to include the stakeholders from the decision making sector as well as from the executive sector who really actually do the work, right? So that what happens that we still, the education, the academia, and especially up to quite an extent the NGO segment, right, of different types,
true.
we still meet Well, and certainly, I mean, in some earlier times, I have seen that these particular people have been meeting a number of times, but there is a real divide between the decision makers and the executive brass, who actually somehow or the other get missed on many occasions, and upon whom actually the biggest responsibility of having these actions, really implementing on ground is there. So this is something where, like, we can do it. Academia can go out with the NGO representatives, with and these journalists can bring up, but ultimately the action is needed. So yes, certainly up to some small level actions are taken. They are taken in the form of some projects, national or international, but unless and until they are brought into in a bigger perspective, that is my point. And one small, I can't say really question, but a query to, I think it was uh, one of the friends who presented regarding some legal issues. In that, if I remember, the presentation was that the court, and the idea was that these rivers can be considered as human beings, having souls and things like that. But Supreme Court stayed. Now, one point there is that the Uttarakhand government, perhaps, they indicated, because I was going through that news item. So Uttarakhand government said that Ganga and Yamuna, both these rivers are very big rivers. They cross against and they cross along all the states. Now, one of the very important constitutional issues and the legal issues is that water is a state subject in our country. So, how can any state actually say that the river is, by virtue of its being passing over the boundaries of several states, it has the onus of having the complete control or having the complete responsibility over the entire stretch? I mean, a state can only look after the river and its tributaries within
Right.
its state, and that will be good enough, actually.
Yeah.
So that was a confusion which I had, and one of that particular point was actually quoted
Yeah.
when the Supreme Court stayed also. So this is just.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Joshi. Neha, you want to ask something? You had a question. And we have some questions there as well, but we have passed the time, but I would take, I think, 2 3 minutes more, if that's okay.
Yeah, one more broader question that I had for some of the panelists here. We did discuss about the various instruments for realizing breaking silos, which seems like a difficult task. For example, ecosystem services, or looking towards the socio-cultural aspects, legal personhood, emotions and grief, or education. So I just wanted some of the panelists to reflect on what does it take to realize these instruments. Tarun, I would like to start with you. Do you want to reflect on this a little bit in terms of methods or the nature of the team?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, Neha. Like in my presentation, I mentioned co-production of knowledge, these kind of three C's that I mentioned. And from the previous comments that were made by the panelists, I think the seeds are actually sown quite early. So I think engineers, for example, need to be sensitized about the environment quite early in their probably with our sort of education discourse that we have in this country. So we often are producer products of silos themselves. So engineers, hydro, civil, they probably just know dams and concretizing things, while ecology students probably only know that. So what's going on with the ecology part? So I think starting something early on, or at least sensitizing them, and I think it also covers the question that Professor Agarwal has on the how can we engage students. So I think it starts from there itself, and to realize a proper transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary project in the end. I think this sort of thing can be only brought about by such discussions. And although
Yeah.
another good point is like the product of all of it, like Professor Joshi said, that would this be absorbed at some level, at at some policy level. um, it's kind of very crisscrossed in that sense, because you have to go bottom up in some sense, and then but you also need a kind of top bottom sensitization of policymakers to actually bring it into practice, and maybe release more funding towards such projects which are, which say that they are integrating several of these disciplines we have spoken about or discussed.
Yeah,
So
thank you, Tarun.
yeah.
I'd like to now hear Rahul on ways to integrate some of the aspects that you spoke about to realize breaking silos.
Right. Thanks for the question. I also wanted to just come back to the question that Professor Himanshu Joshi had said, and I had maintained that in my presentation that the court had stayed the judgment because what is a federal act? So just to say that the limitation of law is such which is inherent in the structure of the federal design in India. To your question, I think there is a difference between constitutional time, so the life of law, as against the life of ecology that it intends to address. So there's no conversation between how lawyers are designing or thinking or doing the litigation around issues of disaster or water, and those who are at the forefront of receiving consequences of these disasters. So I think one way to do, which I'm trying to do in my work here, in this case of legal personhood, is to take these law to ordinary people, and to see if there is the whether law makes sense in everyday life, and has people been able to use this law in order to litigate against some of the violations of their own rights and rights to river that has been happening. But
Right.
it's an incipient law, I must say. I mean, it will have a life of its own on a constitutional time, which is going to be different from community idea of time. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Rahul. Just a follow-up question from the chat box. Probably Rinan can take that up. That how open is science to engaging with some of this collaborative work? How do we rate our own work in breaking silos? Rinan, do you want to attempt answering that?
Okay, I think there are two questions, right? How do we rate our own work in breaking silos, and how open is science to engaging with these collaborative work? I think if I have to speak about my work, I think I probably have been trying my best personally, well, in my work, to try and break silos. It it isn't very easy. So one thing is, maybe you are moving across disciplines, right? So probably things so I mean, there have been times where I have collected information which a lot of people would not consider as data, right? Because you don't have the numbers, so how can it be information? So then that way is because you are getting, for example, if you're getting funding from a place, but their idea of data is something else, and the data that you are collecting is something else. So sometimes it is not that they are averse to it, but sometimes they are. So so it becomes difficult, also because, yeah, so firstly it's like, what data is data, right? So collection of information probably is also
Yeah.
seen differently by different groups, and someone, I think, but there will be people, I mean, if somebody who has seen your work and know what kind of information you've gathered and you're presenting, there will be someone or the other who will appreciate it.
Right.
And apart from how, oh yeah, I think that answers the other question also. They're open to it, but we don't know. And yeah, collaboration is something which is really missing. If so, I mean, I think it is missing in probably the Indian education system, or the way we are trained for it, because we are not asked. I mean, we are told not to talk a lot, right? So sometimes that goes against
Okay.
us, because you are like, who do we talk to? Who do we meet with? So probably, I
Yeah.
think that ways also we need to rethink some of the things. Yeah.
Right. I think we have to collaborate pretty early, maybe in our bachelor's itself or master's when we do master projects, and then under PhD, or like we don't have to wait until we finish our studies itself, to collaborate and to get into different layers. I think that can be a very good starting. So I think we have already like taken a lot of time of the panelists and of the we have shoot time for 10 minutes. I think thank you all for the amazing presentation and talk. I feel all of us has benefited from each other's perspective. I also feel that sometimes we might not agree with each other's point, but I think we have to be sensitive so that we can break silos and work together. And researching sometimes is a very individualistic journey, but as a researcher who's trying to demystify the science, we have to be mindful that where our science is going and how we can collaborate with others, where other people can also benefit from our science, whether we use satellite data or stories or narratives. And thank you everyone. Neha, you want to say something in the end?
Yeah, I think taking this forward, it would be really amazing to sustain this momentum and continue the conversation on breaking silos.
Yeah.
Just that. Thank you.
Professor Joshi, any other panelist who wants to just conclude like final remarks?
Very well done. And as
Okay.
Neha said, continue the momentum.
Yeah, thank you everyone. I hope that we continue this dialogues and like work together. And there is a place when we end the session where you can join in and chat, and other participants can also chat with you on the table. So thank you everyone for your patience. Thank you.